Well, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns the Anti-Federalist. Yes, they did. They absolutely got it right. And something that we're going to do new is this midweek update. Just kind of the break between everything else that's going on. And really want to introduce some of the things that we're working towards with the Samuel Adams Center for Political Science. And what does it mean to develop those constitutional policies? I think that it's really incumbent upon us to consider that all of the think tanks that are out there, all of the pundits that are out there, they talk about that which is immediate, that which is happening, the sensationalize all of that, and especially the think tanks. I've been just really have been frustrated with a lot of them for probably 40 plus years, maybe 50 years. I can say that. But okay, I'll give it a break. 40 plus years. Let's go with that. So what do we have going on? We have all of this, which, boy, I'll tell you what, references that I put up, and I'll put up for Saturday's show on the intelligentsia, including those in the media, including those in the think tanks, including, even those that are in some liberal religious groups that are taking and developing our thoughts. Everything we hear is what's going on with the narrative. It's all about the narrative and who's promoting what narrative. Oh, geez, it was really interesting that the back and forth communication, even at the foundation of this nation, was all about the narrative. It was about what was going on at the very beginning with Parliament and what was happening in the colonies, what was happening, and I'm trying to count, and I have to learn how to use this thing a little better, is that what was happening with the Tories versus the colonists, what was happening with the Tory press versus Sam Adams and his friends and a number of others. What was going on in that context trying to describe a value proposition for liberty? Well, I have to say that the think tanks aren't doing that. You have the Rand Corporation, one of the biggest think tanks. Go on their website, and what they talk about is setting policy and developing policy for their global partners. Well, wait a minute. We're not about global partners. If they want to go do that, that's real interesting. But you know what? They've been screwing up America for a whole lot of years, probably since their inception in about 1948. They should have stayed to some of their military ideas, but when they started getting into all of the religious and social perspectives, then they started attacking even more so than what was attacked at the beginning of the country. Right off the bat. And then what started getting hammered, especially in the late 1800s and into the 1900s. And you can go back to the archives and listen to the programs about Philip Drew, the administrator, and see what that is. A simple read. It's not that much of a read, but the influences of Colonel House took us all the way into the 60s, and just, what occurred was just phenomenal. So, he was like in the pocket of that president in 1913. So some of the insanities that we have there, we'll talk about all of this stuff. But, I guess where I wanted to take today's update is we're seeing all of these continued swamp attacks. And the swamp attacks, quite frankly, I have to tell you, pastors, the majority of you out there, it's your fault. Okay? It's just your fault. You haven't stayed with the true meaning of founders' intent according to the principles that the Anti-Federalists talked about. Yep, I'm going to bring out again today the Anti-Federalist papers, and we're going to talk about Melancton Smith again. He's becoming a real favorite of mine, and it's amazing is that during the open portions and the opening sessions of the New York constitutional debates, we had some pretty good arguments that were going on the first day. And then Melancton Smith was able to get up and he talked. The perspective that he brought, and the other perspective that I'll bring out a little bit more on Saturday that affects policy and what's happened in policy since the mid-1800s is that the value proposition that the First Great Awakening had to develop the thought processes of the Founding Fathers was the core element in who we are as America and who we should be as America. But when you have all of these other great policy centers and don't bring that into the truth and the reality, then you have the stuff that's like coming out in Google this week. You talk about a subversive organization. Oops, I got to be careful because I'm going to post this up on YouTube. Oh my. Anyway, the fact is that social justice started in the mid-1800s, and that's because the true gospel, the truth of what is our foundational principles within morality and virtue, were not adhered to, and you went into the social gospel nonsense, and the social gospel then comes into the social justice insanity. And when you really understand social justice and all of that, it's it's all socialism, and in some respects goes down into even fascism and communism. So I think that's what's happening inside of Google right now, and maybe Facebook, and maybe some of the other high-tech industries. Remember, I was an executive in high tech, so I got a real perspective, and I used to speak at some of the major conferences way back when. So, I've got a sense of high tech because I was there, but what's really important is what is our founders' intent? What is it that brings us to that point of saying, how do we look at policy today? How do we format policy in a perspective that is going to restructure our constitutionalism? I've been working on the book. Yes, it's coming out. I call it the short version of the Tale of Two Constitutions. Again, that's on YouTube. And the real interesting aspect is that the swamp started coming in because we left our moral determination. So with that, we can go down a lot of roads in that. And I'll tell you what, I've been really spending a lot of time in Jeremiah lately. And I just have to simply tell you that there's nothing new under the sun. And the geopolitical environment in Jeremiah, with all of the governmental perversions that we see today, and the industrial perversions, and the Google perversions, and the school perversions, and all of that is because I think Jeremiah speaks to it all. Yeah, it very, very interesting. But a couple of things that I wanted to touch here before we leave in just a few short minutes, because I want to keep these midweek updates kind of short and try and get then to several points that we can look at as principles, and then we can work on developing what is it to have real constitutional policy instead of the fake stuff that is coming out of all of these different think tanks and policy centers. So, you had this argument that was going on, the challenges with Hamilton, the debates were moving forward, and very, very interesting is that Mr. Smith, Melancton Smith, he actually starts talking about and referencing back to what is not Robert Yates, but it was, one of the other speakers that opened up the convention and was actually talking about, something out of the Bible. Can you believe that? He was talking about what was going on with Babylon and how that all structured look from the one dream that one of the kings of Babylon was having. And the way that Langton Smith kind of retorts all of that is that in the early debates, it was intent that the Constitution was not a confederacy, but a reduction of all the states into a consolidated government. And that was the intention of Hamilton and a number of the others, is that how does that work? And I think it's clearly recognizable today that we do not have the federalism that everybody stomps up and down about. And I think I mentioned that in last week's program, and we're going to continue that in this week's Saturday program, is that we need to look at what a real confederated republic has and all its advantages as a republic and from a confederation perspective. You know, they really threw the baby out with the bathwater in this, and that the real thing is that the 17th Amendment really killed what we have as a constitution, as many other aspects of treaties and all of that. But what he gets into really interestingly and talks about is that we may wander, he said, in the fields of fancy without end and gather flowers as we go. It may be entertaining, but it is a lot of little services to the discovery of truth. We may, on one side, compare the schemes advocated by our opponents to the golden images. Now here it is, the golden images with feet part of iron and part of clay. And on the other to the beast dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly have great iron teeth, which devours, breaks in pieces, and stamps the residue with its feet. And after all, he said, we shall find that both the allusions are taken from the same vision, and their true meaning must be discovered by sober reasoning. He goes into a further discussion relative to how will this Constitution destroy our freedoms. And we have seen that over and over again, especially when it comes into representation. He continues with that analogy in talking about the instance that have been adduced by the gentleman from sacred history was an example in point to prove this. The nation of Israel, having received a form of civil government from heaven, enjoyed it for a considerable period, but at length laboring under pressures which were brought upon them by their own misconduct and imprudence, instead of imputing their misfortunes to their true causes and making a proper improvement of their calamities by a correction of their errors, they imputed them to a defect in their constitution. They rejected their divine ruler and asked Samuel to make them a king to judge them like other nations. Samuel was grieved at their folly, but still, by the command of God, he hearkened to their voice, though not until he had solemnly declared unto them the manner in which the king should reign over them. Then he goes into the discussion about what that king would look like and how that king would take their belongings, take their children, take their young men, take their young women, force them into service for himself and his pleasures, how the properties would be taken, so on and so forth. I think the analogy that he was driving to here is that, yes, the federal government is doing all of that and more. We can see that in taxation and so on. But I think what's really becomes interesting in this first day of argument is what is fair representation. He challenges us, and I will challenge you to go look up what is still out there as the real First Amendment that has not been fully ratified, and that is about representation. So what we have going on right now, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have the House and the Senate that's out stumping. They're taking a break, and a lot of times they say, well, you know, Congress isn't supposed to sit all the time. Well, then Congress shouldn't get paid all the time either. And the other aspect that the founders intended was that what? Congress would live by the same rules and laws that they, foist on all of us. So when it comes to the likes of Congress Care, aka Obamacare, then it should be 100% that they are not exempted from it, but under the general principle of the founders' original intent, Congress needs to abide and live under the same rules and regulations that are foisted upon us, we the people. And to that extent, do you really believe that the senators are supposed to represent you as a general population? Also, do you really think that your state congressperson can represent 1.5, 1.2, 1 million people? Where the founders originally intended that, it should be 1 in 30,000. And when you look at the ratio of that compared to the fact that there was 3 million people in the colonies at that time, and they even argued saying, you know what, we'll concede to 1, and the Anti-Federalists did 1 in 50,000. And I think that original First Amendment is kind of in that respect. So why don't you do some homework on that? And I think that would be very interesting if that would be something that we really bring together. So from a policy perspective, I think the first one that is very founders' intent correct that we need to speak to is that about Congress living according to that and under that which they foist upon us. You see, because we're not really represented in the way that we should be. I mean, I have a good relationship with my congressman's staffer, but that doesn't mean, really a whole lot when it comes to how he interrelates with those that may be larger. And you know what? We're going to talk about that when it comes to what is it from a policy perspective and understanding the value proposition of representation. So in that, guys, and in that format, the first policy issue that we can take on is, Congress, all along, everything that you pass, you need to live under it. You need to stand by that perspective alone. Because we know, constitutionally, they're doing everything they're supposed to do based on, as I talk about, that we have the amendments, we have all of these treaties, we have all of these international executive orders, so on and so forth. So in many ways, they're functioning according to their constitutional legislative rights, if you will. But that doesn't mean that they are right in the way that they develop policy. And then the other component is that you need to do some homework on these think tanks and this intelligentsia. And you know what? I think you might be able to think for yourself. Don't you? Don't you think you could think for yourself? I would think so. And with that, you know what? The think tanks aren't doing us any good, folks. And we need to adhere to a sense of founders' intent, original intent for constitutionalism. And that's what you're going to hear more about as we look at Samuel Adams returning and Samuel Adams Center for Political Science and what that all means. So, you know what? Come on back to the program on Saturday. And this midweek, we'll see how it works. Here we go with Samuel Adams Returns, the Anti-Federalists Got It Right. And this is the midweek session. You know what? Have a great time for the rest of your week and a super weekend. Bye-bye.